So I'm going to be talking primarily about the connection between rents and wages. So I'm going to be throwing lots of numbers at you, but I'll try not to be too mathy. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is I think we need to start this conversation with what does affordability mean? Now, what affordability means in our lives is a little bit different than what affordability means in the law. And so I want to make sure to put that out there so we're kind of using the same language. So right now in the Seattle area, the median income for a household is $88,000 a year. Okay? So when we have legislation being passed and laws being made about affordability, they're aiming for households of $88,000 a year. That's why we have a little bit of things that are a little messed up and confused. So that's kind of where we're starting with. Now, if you make the new minimum wage, which is the $10 an hour, I know there are other places that are making 11, but we still have people at 10. If you are making $10 an hour and working full time, your gross income, so not what you're taking home, but your gross income is $20,800. So that is a far cry away from the $88,000 a year. So this is where we're getting into a lot of disparities. One of the most conservative estimates that I could find, and I look for the most conservative one because that helps to kind of frame the conversation that even people on the very conservative end are going to tend to agree with the numbers. So according to the National Realtors Association, so an organization that is working primarily for the interests of for-profit landlords, has cited in their research that rents have gone up 26% in the last 5 years. So this isn't even counting like 2008 and any of that stuff, just the last 5 years. 26% rents have gone up. Wages have only gone up 15% over that time. Okay, so even the most conservative estimate shows that there is a gap between where rents are and where wages are. So this is not a disputable piece of information. I think that's a really powerful thing for us to always come to the conversation with. When we're looking at a lot of the legislation that we have where we're looking at minimum wages, where we're looking at rental affordability, the reason I brought up those numbers is because it's important to keep in mind that what we're aiming for and where we're at is not the same. So if where we've legislated minimums is $20,000 a year, why are we legislating affordability at $88,000 a year, right? These things do not add up. So if you look at our incentive zoning laws, so that's kind of how Seattle tries to create affordable housing where there isn't one, besides public housing, there are things called incentive zoning laws. So the incentive zoning laws tell a developer, if you give us 20% of the units in your building at affordable, and we just heard what that means, if you give us 20 units at affordable, then we'll give you some tax credits. You'll get some tax exemption on your building per your square footage for your property taxes. So right now, a for-profit developer who opts into that program, so it's not mandatory, it can be. There are lots of cities that make it mandatory, but it's optional right now. If they opt in, they're making units for people making between, and this is for a single household of a single person, they're making units for people making between $40,000 and $46,000 a year. Double the minimum wage is where they're incentivizing building those units. So when the mayor starts talking about those 20,000 units he wants to see built, unless we start really organizing around what that means to us in real life, they're going to be the $40,000 to $46,000 units for one person. Okay? And those rents are still $1,200 a month because it assumes that even that person is going to pay 30% of their income to rent. So that's the rent that our elected officials, our for-profit developers are patting themselves on the back for when they give us a $1,200 unit. And that, at least for me and looking at most of your faces, is not really the point. If we're going to go the extra mile and create these incentive programs and we're going to give away tax exemptions, I think we want more for that. I think we want way more affordability than that. Thank you. So when we're looking back at the wages and the incomes, the wages and the rents, one thing to keep in mind is that in Washington State, there is no limit on how much your landlord can raise your rent. There is a cap on how much time they have to notify you. In the state of Washington, it's 30 days. In Seattle, it's 60 days. So they have to tell you that they're going to raise it, but there is no limit. So they could raise it 5%, 10%, or what we saw happen in West Seattle, 140%. Okay, so there aren't limits. However, even union-protected jobs are only projecting 3% increases in wages per year. So how are we ever expected to keep up with rent with those kinds of disparities, right? So when we're looking at those types of things, and then we ask ourselves, why is there still homelessness? It's not really hard to understand, When you can no longer afford the Starbucks coffee, you stop buying the Starbucks coffee. When you can no longer afford rent, there's homelessness. So, and that's when we're seeing people starting to pay even more than that 30% of their income to rent. So 30% is typically considered to be affordable. Although I think we know that people who make high wages don't pay 30% of their income to rent, right? It's only those of us in the bottom part of the income spectrum who are expected to pay that much to rent. So we're just keeping that in mind. That's my next point, right? So a study was done recently by Harvard University that showed that 50% of the renters in the United States are paying between 30 and 50% of their incomes to rent. And in the King County area, that number is 47.2%. So 47.2% of our neighbors are paying between 30 and 50% of their income just to rent. No health care, no food, no child care, just to keep a roof over their head. So there are a couple of things that we can do. I'm very action oriented too, so I have to go in. That's going to be my last point of the things that we can do. Our friend here who was talking about the town hall that's happening on Thursday and the issue about bonding. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The state legislature just passed a piece of legislation that's going to allow King County to start bonding for affordable housing. So that's a nice first step. Seattle can do the same kind of thing and start bonding to create our own housing, buy property, whether it's land or a current building, and build and really make those units ourselves instead of waiting for the market, who is, again, aiming for that $88,000 a year. Instead of waiting for them to try to meet us where we need it, we can build it ourselves. There are right to shelter laws in other states where it is a law on the books that no one sleeps outside. A right to shelter is a great way to prioritize our resources to make sure that we're not leaving people outside, that when the shelters are full, we find another place to put them. We open up our community centers, we open up libraries, we open up office spaces, we open up whatever we have to make sure people aren't sleeping outside. That's right. One-for-one replacement is also another piece of legislation that has been batted around here and there. What that says is that when you buy a building, so like the Lock Haven apartments that were affordable housing that was lost, if that owner is going to take those units and knock them down and build new units, and we're going to lose all that affordability, they are responsible for making sure that units at the prices that were lost are replaced someplace else in the city. And that is a way of the city holding developers accountable to not just building for their own profit, but building for what makes our communities healthy. So those are a couple of ideas that are out there. I hope that you'll come to the town hall next Thursday and hear about more. And use this information as power. When people start talking about affordability, make sure to tell them, do you mean affordability by the law or affordability by reality? Because we need to get those together.